America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and I thought we'd start off by just talking about some of the economic issues, but we won't get too much in the deep weeds, but do want to talk about why it matters to you. Then we're going to talk about this push for a digital ID, which is a very significant push in Europe. Of course, it already has been implemented in China, but what does that mean to you here in the United States? Of course, we are also going to spend some time looking at this election next week, because a very good piece by Ben Shapiro on Generation Zohran, Generation Z, as he puts it, and then also a piece by Star Parker about Democratic Socialist Party. And I think I might come back to something I mentioned yesterday in the second hour. Since some of you do not hear the second hour, I thought I would reaffirm that, because there's some new information about how Bill Gates is really kind of backing off this climate change hysteria just before you have this UN conference on that regard. So all sorts of things we're going to cover in the first hour. Second hour, we're going to be privileged to have with us Jason Riley, senior fellow with the Manhattan Institute. He's also a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and his book is entitled The Affirmative Action Myth: Why Blacks Don't Need Racial Preferences to Succeed. And it is going to be quite an interview, I suspect. He is an individual we've quoted. As a matter of fact, I looked up, and about 24 times, just using the search engine, we either are quoting his articles, posting his articles, something of that nature. So an individual that you certainly will, I think, appreciate hearing from. But my first article is about the Federal Reserve, and the Wall Street Journal. The editors there said the Federal Reserve is driving in a fog. That will be more significant in just a minute. But I love how they use kind of a phrase from the Bible: what the Federal Open Margaret Committee giveth, it also taketh away. Of course, that's King James of Book of Job. But nevertheless, no sooner had the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell handled Wall Street a quarter-point interest rate cut Wednesday than Mr. Powell spoiled the party by warning that another cut may not arrive in December. So confused by mixed signals, so is the Fed. They said the reduction in the Fed rates from 0.75 to 4% to, again, despite an economy that's starting to feel like stagflation. Yet, if you talk about inflation, I'm going to get to this in just a minute, the original target was 2%. It should be 0, but you know how that goes. But it's a much higher than that right now. And the Fed chief said, well, it's almost 3%, 2.8%, but it wouldn't be quite as high without tariffs. Maybe 2.3, 2.4%, but that's admitting that they're not hitting the target even without the tariffs. And by the way, I don't necessarily agree that the tariffs are doing all that, but we'll leave that for another discussion and another day. The bottom line is the Fed is supposed to deal with price stability and full employment, having difficulty with both. But one of the things that was interesting, he asked during the press conference, what do you do when you're driving in a fog? You slow down. Well, I think the Wall Street Journal is in a fog. And again, the idea is, well, are they going to end quantitative tightening, which means they would then be for quantitative easing, or a nice way of saying open up the printers to print more dollars, and that is certainly the case. And so they go on, and I won't get into all the details, but those of you that are in the economic realm probably will appreciate the fact that we've posted this 3-page summary that comes from the Federal Reserve and from the Wall Street Journal about how, again, Mr. Powell is admittedly in a tough position. Faced with contradictory data about two prongs of a mandate in conflict, he must pick one to focus on. With a president sniping at him to ease money at every opportunity, but inflation, in our view, remains the biggest threat until it's vanquished. So they want to get rid of inflation, but here is the problem. I have a commentary coming out next week, but I'll give you a preview, and that is to recognize that in some respects that illustrates what you might call an economic dilemma that is facing not only Jerome Powell, but is facing the Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, and certainly facing the President of the United States, Donald Trump. And that is, we are, in one case, dealing with an economy we're told is doing fine, but how are you doing? Probably not as well. I get a lot of individuals that say, yeah, the stock market's going up, but when I go to the grocery store, I'm having trouble putting healthy food on the table. When I go get gas, sometimes I wonder if I should fill up the tank. And when I'm trying to pay my debts, that's become very difficult. And so as a result, a lot of Americans right now are cutting to survive. They aren't going on vacation. Students wonder if they'll be able to pay off their student loans. And of course, we've had the Next Generation Roundtable raising a very fundamental question. Will the youngest generation be able to own a home? And so with inflation at 2%, now 3%, they feel like they're being clipped, almost like the proverbial frog boiling in a kettle. And so as a result, this is the economic dilemma facing policymakers and Americans, because American consumers would like lower interest rates. Why? Well, that would be lower credit card rates. That would mean lower mortgage rates. But lowering interest rates, as you just heard the editors of the Wall Street Journal point out, really can't help you fight inflation. And so in some respects, at the same time, you have the government and the Federal Reserve trying to make sure that they keep the economy out of recession. So that's why many people are simply saying it's going to eventually become a time of the big print. And I'll hold up this book, this one by Larry Lepard. We've mentioned it before. And if the title sounds familiar, here's the one from Michael Lewis, The Big Short. That one was the story, of course, in 2008. But a lot of people had trouble seeing that collapse of the housing market back then, and so that's what this book, or if you've seen the movie, is all about. Larry Lepard uses the same kind of idea in which he says, we may be headed for a big print. And if indeed that is the case, that maybe postpones some of the issues in front of us, but it's simply one more attempt to kick the can down the road. But as Larry Lepard points out, we're running out of road. And the impact that that's going to have is very significant. So while I think sometimes when you talk about, well, did the Federal Reserve on Wednesday cut rates? Yes, a little bit. Well, what does it mean to me? Well, it could mean quite a bit. If for no other reason, then I think quite a lot of you, a significant number of you, however you want me to say it, are dealing with this economic dilemma. You would like lower interest rates. You would like lower credit card rates. You would like lower mortgage rates. But you also would like to not have inflation. And you have individuals who are at each other, almost at each other's throats about this, whether you see Donald Trump on one side and Jerome Powell on the other, or a variety of other players and actors in the midst of it. And it's just an illustration, again, why we will continue to be talking about some of these economic issues here on Point of View. They seem kind of distant and arcane. I mean, what's the Federal Reserve? I don't even know what it is. By the way, our November issue is already out, is one that you'll be receiving soon, is all about the Federal Reserve, so we will, of course, cover that as well. But if nothing else, just thought I would acknowledge something that happened yesterday and look down the road to see what it might mean in the future for you and your family. Let's take a break. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In this commentary, I want to explain an interesting business pattern that developed in China. It illustrates what many have called the catfish effect. What's the catfish effect? Well, live sardines are more expensive than frozen sardines and more valuable because they have better flavor and texture. One ship in Norway has always been able to bring sardines home because the captain put a catfish in the tank. The sardines had to keep swimming to avoid their predator. The catfish effect is used in business to describe what happens when the strong competitor stimulates the other companies to be more competitive and innovative. The Tesla Gigafactory in Shanghai is often cited as the catfish. This explains China's unique exception to their general business model. China has worked to keep many companies out of the country. Those they let in come under full control of the Chinese government. Tesla was the exception. China supported the company with land, loans, and tax benefits. That seemed like a puzzle until you realized that Tesla became the catfish for China's electric vehicle industry. They set up shop and immediately began selling cars, but their presence stimulated the other electric car companies. They started copying the techniques used by Tesla in production and deploying camera-based autopilot. Tesla also discovered they needed parts that weren't being manufactured in China. By demanding these cutting-edge materials from suppliers, they were also providing them to the other China car companies. Once the Tesla catfish was dropped into the China tank, all the companies started swimming faster. That is why China did something few expected. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, talk about privacy, and I just might hold up one of the booklets we've done on privacy and surveillance, and that one came out many years ago, and we will certainly update it in light of the conversation we're going to have in this next few minutes, and then one that's a little more recent, which is called Big Data, and those are just an illustration of the fact that we have quite a number of institutions, whether corporations or especially the government, collecting more and more information on us. Well, again, they can use that information to market products to us, and we may actually appreciate that. As I've said before, when I go to, for example, Barnes & Noble and buy a book, oftentimes on the receipt it says, if you like this book, you might like these books. And, of course, whenever I buy something on Amazon, oh, since you seem to like this, maybe you would like that. So, in some respects, that's helpful in a marketing point of view. But how much information do we want the government to have is a really important question, and that's why over the years I've quoted from this book by Neil Richards. It's a very thick book and not for the faint-hearted, published by Oxford University Press, called Why Privacy Matters. And for just a minute, I want to maybe get into that because it is a topic that I'm finding more and more people want to come back to. On Sunday, I had a chance to meet somebody who was familiar with the program, and one of the questions she asked was, well, what are the topics you're really addressing here lately on Point of View? And I said, well, one of those is the one we just did, economic issues. But then she brought up immediately these data centers, which are sprouting up all over the place. much of the data centers are there for AI, artificial intelligence, and we will certainly be covering that in the future, as you might imagine, on an Outlook magazine. But also, she was concerned about the amount of information the government is collecting on us. So Michael Brendan Dougherty is writing about this idea of a digital ID. And first of all, he tries to talk about why it might be seen and portrayed as being positive. Because he says, in some ways, I understand why there is some demand for a digital ID. In theory, a digital ID could offer individuals more privacy. Instead of handing your driver's license over to a bouncer who then learns your name, address, home state, exact birth date, and what class of vehicle you're licensed to drive, you could simply confirm via your phone that you're over 21 and allowed into a bar. Or if you're traveling and want to easily grant foreign doctors access to your medical records, a digital ID makes verifying just the needed information possible, limiting unnecessary data exposure. And quite frankly, that's the first of many justifications why you're seeing this being proposed in Europe. But the title of his piece is "The Rush to Digital ID is Creepy." So let's get into it. He says, 20 years ago, the British government under Tony Blair passed the Identity Cards Act to introduce a digital ID. And they were then to carry biometric data and track every use of an ID there. The argument, of course, was that this would bring down administrative cost and also help fight terrorism. So far, so good. Now Europe, he says, is barreling forward with plans to introduce digital IDs across the continent on an accelerated timeline, and it's going to require every member state of the European Union to offer citizens and businesses a standardized digital ID wallet within the next 2 years. He says, still, there's something unsettling about this drive and the rush to implement it. Bundling so many systems together means any problem with the digital ID could leave a person almost entirely locked out of their life, their online identities, their finances, everything. Of course, you've heard people talk about, and we've talked about it as well, which is why we will come back to this issue again, probably not only in an Outlook article, but in an updated booklet, on the fact that this digital ID would also give you the permission or keep you from having access to the internet. Because the argument there is well, when you're anonymous, you're probably dangerous. So the only people we'll let onto the internet are people that actually have that digital ID. But, Michael Brendan Dougherty has a couple other questions. Can the EU, that would be the European Union, really guarantee that it will do a better job of protecting my data than Adobe? 153 million accounts exposed, better than JP Morgan Chase, 83 million households and small businesses exposed, or better than Facebook, 540 million accounts exposed, or Equifax, 147 million records exposed. Do you see the point? Do we really think that the government is hack-proof, given the fact that some of these major companies, which have spent a lot of time, energy, and money, were hacked anyway? I just think you can see the potential problem. But it goes down to the issue not just of digital ID, but surveillance and privacy. Because he says, beyond the issue of government holding this trove, whether as a treasury to protect or as a resource to mine, they will inevitably start viewing it as a tool for gleaning insights about their citizens. And here's the other danger: it risks becoming a giant data panopticon for the continent. Okay, first of all, it brings us back to the booklet on big data. Or if you say, okay, I've never heard this idea of a panopticon. First of all, I've done numerous columns on it. Again, to go to pointofview.net, type on panopticon, P-A-N-O-P-T-I-C-O-N. And if that's not familiar to you, it was first proposed by Jeremy Bentham. He was saying, how could we end up having maybe a secure prison jail, but I'll use prison as the better example, so that we could reduce the number of individuals that would even have to guard the prisoners. And the concept was to have a centralized area where the prisoners are, and then lights shining so that they could not see how many people were actually watching them 24/7. And so this idea of a panopticon is something that has been used, I think, and it's a more accurate illustration than talking about 1984 or something of that nature, because that's really what this is. You would never know when the government was using this kind of data against you. And then goes on to say the obvious, and that is more troubling. He says, the digital ID that Europe hopes to impose bears a striking resemblance to the front end of a Chinese-style social credit system. And again, give me an ability to be able to determine who you are and use a digital ID to determine whether you buy or don't buy certain goods. And I can now control you in unbelievable ways. I think maybe you've just been spending too much money on meat, and I'll just simply not let you to buy any meat. I think you've been traveling entirely too much, and so your digital ID will not allow you to buy any more gas for your car or your truck. You know the game. You pose a potential risk to the state simply because of something you've posted, and you won't be able to buy an airplane ticket, or in China, you won't be able to get on a train. And we know the drill. And so again, he says the problems that digital ID solves are real, but comparatively minor. It risks an enormous, and the risks are enormous. The scramble to introduce digital IDs is frankly creepy. That's the title of his piece, and it's just a reminder again that from time to time we're going to come back to this, because as we have mentioned before, there is such a push right now to build more and more of these data centers, and the reason for that is simple. That is, the best estimates I can come up with are that every time you do an AI search, it is using 10 times the energy of a typical, say, Google or Bing search. And so as a result, we're going to need more energy. We're going to even perhaps need more data centers. But what does that look like in the 21st century? And, of course, as we have some of you called in and say, well, is that the 666 or is that the beast? And I don't want to jump ahead, but are there possibilities that some of that could be used against us? Whether you believe in an Antichrist, which I do, or you don't believe that that even is going to happen in the future, simply any dictator, any leader, any authoritarian leader would love to have all this data and love to have this kind of control with a digital ID. So we haven't talked about that much, and so because Michael Brendan Doherty wrote about it, I wanted to put that up. It is our second article, and it's a reminder again that these are the kinds of things we need to pay attention to, and this is why we've written booklets on the subject of privacy and surveillance and some of the dangers of the big data. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Let's switch topics now and talk about climate change. And again, we've done a booklet on that, but again, that one will need some revision, especially since it came out 6 years ago. I think it is about time, but especially in light of what has been really rattling the cages of a lot of people in the environmental movement. And if you were listening to the program yesterday, or if you have a radio station that doesn't carry the second hour, let me just rehearse what we talked about, and that is Bill Gates. Yes, that Bill Gates, the co-founder of Microsoft, actually put out a memo that has had incredible impact, because he says now that climate change will not lead to humanity's demise, and he says it's really time for climate change advocates to do some kind of pivot and move away from what he calls a doomsday outlook. And that is really kind of a sharp departure from where he was a few years ago, in which he said that climate change will be one of the greatest challenges humans have ever taken on, greater than landing on the moon, greater than eradicating smallpox, even greater than putting a computer on every desk. Now, again, I don't want to claim that I always can read people's minds, but I could see this coming, because let me again hold up his book for those of you watching online. This book has the title, How to Avoid the Climate Disaster. But the subtitle really tells you almost everything you need to know about the book. I read these very long books, so you don't need to, and this is more than 200 pages. But the subtitle is The Solutions We Have and the Breakthroughs We Need. If you start reading through what he talks about in terms of how we plug in, how we make things, how we grow things, how we get around, how we keep cool and stay warm, and then of course he has a whole chapter there on adapting to a warmer world, almost like he assumed that that was going to be the case. There are certainly those breakthroughs we need. If you really sort of read between the lines, we're talking about, if you will, technological breakthroughs that we don't have and don't see on the horizon. Some of those almost require rewriting the laws of chemistry and physics, and you know that's not going to happen. And I think he kind of came face to face with the fact that maybe it is time to have this strategic pivot in which, even though we have the climate warming somewhat, the temperature has been going up, and that's pretty obvious to anybody that looks at those records, there may be other ways to address this issue. And he's starting to sound a lot more like Bjorn Lomborg. I mentioned yesterday, Bjorn Lomborg is known for his book, The Skeptical Environmentalist. But Bjorn Lomborg posted this book, which I'll hold up, called False Alarm: How Climate Change Panic Costs Us Trillions, Hurts the Poor, and Fails to Fix the Planet. And so what, all of a sudden, just before this new United Nations Convention, which is taking place, and this goes all the way back to the Paris Accords, but we have another one taking place in the future here in Brazil, is maybe we need to do things that help the poor. And that relates to this very good piece by Bjorn Lomborg, this book as well, Best Things First, in which he shows the low cost and the tremendous benefits of taking the 12 most efficient solutions for the world's poorest and the global promises. And again, first 3 chapters, kind of introductory chapters, and then from chapter 4 all the way on, 12 chapters talking about things that we can and should do if we really want to help the poor. And to his credit, there are a lot of times when I disagree with Bill Gates, and I know you do too. I will give him at least partial credit for the fact that his goal has been with some of these initiatives is to try to help third world countries. I think some of his solutions are questionable, to put it mildly, but nevertheless, at least that's his goal. And you're now starting to see him with his memo rattling a lot of cages and starting to create all sorts of pushback. And it was interesting because even though this has created a bit of a stir, it has hasn't quite made it out to the mainstream media yet. I was talking this morning with somebody that does speak on climate change, and he hadn't heard of the Bill Gates memo, so you may be hearing it for the first time. But this new piece by Noah Rothman goes into it in more details, because he says now this Bill Gates memo may touch off a mad scramble for the cash that the donor class is still willing to contribute to climates. He reminds us of some of those predictions. You know, the islands there in the South Seas will have used up all their fresh drinking water, and so as a result, it'll be uninhabitable. The Gaza Strip, because of the terrorist government, is ecologically uninhabitable and will not even be a place where people can live by 2020. In 1985, air pollution have the amount of sunlight, and as a result, that's the case. Children will stop remembering what snow looks like because we won't have snow anymore. And, of course, you can talk about the polar bears and a variety of others. But he goes through this long, long list. And it's just a reminder that all these predicted scenarios, you might be thinking, I don't remember those happening. Well, it's because they didn't. And interestingly enough, Bill Gates in his memo says, although climate change will have serious consequences, nobody's denying that, particularly for people in the what? Poorest countries, it will not lead to humanity's demise. And he says this is a time to refocus on the metric that should count even more than emissions and temperature change, and that is improving lives. Well, as he is talking about this, you have two groups. Those who say, okay, maybe this is time to maybe pull back a little bit, recognize that if we want to help the poor, maybe we've promised what we can do through climate change legislation or through the Green New Deal. There are going to be others that are calling for degrowth, deindustrialization, and a variety of others. But the point that Noah Rothman is making, and I hadn't thought about it until I saw his piece just today, and that is the fact that there is going to be this scramble for funds. Because he says for much of this century, it has simply been best practice for charitable groups to graft climate change onto their statements of purpose, irrespective of what their purpose happened to be. You name it. Save the Children, United Way, Salvation Army, World Vision International. By the way, two of those are Christian groups, by the way. Even the ASPCA have had to take a bite, he says, from the climate change apple. Now, because of Bill Gates' memo, it may just represent that they would have the freedom now to not only stop sending the money, but maybe even back away from some of those doomsday predictions that they would repeat even on their own webpage. And so in some respects, it will be interesting to see how this plays out. Greta Thunberg is probably going to be full bore against what he said, but in some respects, this is Gates' memo. Bill Gates' memo has established what the New York Times called, and again, let's give credit to the New York Times for this, a false dichotomy, in which you actually have this idea that if we don't act now, it is the end of civilization as we know it. And so that is the case. And this conviction that mankind, that human beings are living on borrowed time, and the only way we can begin to forestall a climate change apocalypse is by simply implementing all the different aspects of everything from the Green New Deal to all the requirements of the Paris Climate Accords. And so, in short, those who are desperate to preserve their access to capital will accuse those who fail to propagate this climate change apocalypticism, he says, of seeking only access to capital. But again, Bill Gates, he's not worried about capital, one of the richest men in the world, but instead, I think, is recognizing, as does people like Bjorn Lomborg, that if we really want to help the poor, we need to think about some very important issues. And again, I highly recommend this book by Bjorn Lomborg because he talks about what we need to do, and there are certain things we do need to do. Address the issues of tuberculosis, education, malaria, even the issues of nutrition and chronic disease. diseases and such topics as immunization and trade and land tenure security and a variety of others. A rare and very insightful book that is really trying to say, if you really are concerned about the poor, there are things we can and should do, but the Green New Deal is not one of those. Matter of fact, on the front here, it has a picture of a low-cost, high-benefit. He could, on the back, I wish he had done that, shown the cost, the high cost and low benefit of all the attempts to address the climate change issues, because there are real significant economic consequences to those as well. Anyway, if you have not heard about the Bill Gates memo, it has certainly caused a stir, and you probably have just heard about it for the first time here on Point of View, but I suspect you'll hear a lot more, and I suspect we'll be doing some commentaries, books, and even articles and outlook in the future, all about some of the things he's now saying that he was saying before in his book, but now take seriously. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
In the few minutes left, I thought I would mention two different articles we've posted, one by Ben Shapiro, one by Star Parker. Both have to do with, of course, this election that is taking place in New York City next week and the reality I think, almost foregone conclusion that Zohran Mamdani is going to be the mayor. But let's get into this, because Ben Shapiro says Generation Z stands for Zohran, because he asks a good question or two. How does a 33-year-old lifelong do-nothing, a person who has never held a real job, never suffered a true challenge, been handed everything on a silver platter, turn into a mayoral frontrunner in New York City? How does a self-described socialist who despises capitalism become the leading candidate for the mayor's race of the world's financial capital? And then, of course, he gets into the intifada and a variety of other things like that, and you know the list, and so we'll move on, because he says the answer is simple and obvious. Zohran Mamdani represents a solid movement within Generation Z. I do want to get some comments tomorrow. We're going to have Jeff Mateer as well as Liberty McCarter on about that, and showed the various run of individuals and how he has done among the younger generation. And he says this isn't a coincidence, it's reality. It's not that Mamdani has hidden his career or his lifelong record of insane radicalism. He hasn't. He certainly allows his freak flag to fly. But he goes on to say that in some respects, what older voters see as a bug, younger voters see as a feature. And despite right-wing commentators hoping against hope that the next generation, Generation Z, will swing heavily to the right, the poll numbers actually show the opposite. According to a YouGov poll, President Donald Trump's current approval rate among those under the age of 30 is 29%. According to a recent poll from the Cato Institute and YouGov, 62% of Americans aged 18 to 29 say they are favorable towards socialism. You can also go to a spring 2025 Yale Youth poll, found that younger voters are consistently far to the left of the generation population. So what is the general philosophy, he says, of Generation Z? Ingrained victimhood. They have been diagnosed, of course, with all sorts of mental conditions, and then there are many others that are undiagnosed. And he says what is so ironic of all of this is that given the fact that Generation Z is the richest and freest generation in all of human history. I'm not sure I'd say it with that much hyperbole, but let's go on. He says more Generation Z people hold degrees than millennials. Generation Xers did, or that millennials or Generation Xers did at that age, according to some of the studies done by The Economist. And then going on from The Economist, the typical 25-year-old Gen Zer has an annual household income of over $40,000, more than 50% above baby boomers at the same age. Not sure that was adjusted for inflation, but that's the numbers anyway. And he says we have spent years informing young Americans that their country is irrevocably flawed, that they have no path to success, and that the future for them is loneliness and stagnation. And so he says all of this must be reversed if America is to be saved. It's a rather dismal look from Ben Shapiro, but again, I trust the statistics he cites. I think some of the conclusions may, again, be a little overdrawn, but it illustrates the task we have before us. Which now brings me to another friend of this ministry, and that's Star Parker. She begins by telling us what was happening in Argentina. I've followed that, but I suspect many of you probably never heard the name Javier Milei, but he is the president of Argentina. He ran last time as president and won, and is representing a very definite conservative view. He won the presidency 2 years ago, brandishing a chainsaw as a message on how to cut away the runaway government. I think that chainsaw was passed on to Elon Musk, if you remember that. And what is interesting is even though big government has always been kind of a tradition in Argentina, now economic growth is picking up and inflation is down, and it is very interesting to see what might happen in the future. They're not out of the weeds at all. They're not out of the chaos and turmoil at all. I oftentimes use Argentina as an example of a currency being devalued very, very quickly. But nevertheless, She says, ironically, as people in Argentina voted to support the leadership of a politician, the likes of whom they have never seen, someone running to shrink government and advance liberty, in America's largest city, New York, they're about to elect a new mayor who touts all the ideas that have been destroying Argentina. I love the back and forth. What's the list? Well, she gives us the short list. Rent control, free buses, free childcare, city-owned grocery stores. The only thing missing, she says, is free ice cream for all, and pay for it by taxing the wealthy and taxing businesses. Well, affordability and this whole issue of making New York more affordable implies lower costs, lower prices, but raising wages, which they want to raise to minimum wage of $30 an hour, and raising business taxes increases prices. Surely, she says, a third grader can figure this out. Apparently not some of the voters there in New York City. We cannot, as she said, dismiss this as a sign of a direction of national sentiment. Specifically, the socialist seeds are planted, she says, in the Democratic Party. As I recently reported, and I talked about last time we had her article on our website, new Gallup poll shows that 2/3, 66% of Democrats have a positive view of socialism, and less than half, 42% of Democrats have a positive view of capitalism. So she says it's not just a matter of clear experience with the failure of socialism. Just recently, the Fraser Institute, that's one up in Canada, published its annual Economic Freedom of the World report. The report shows with clarity that countries that are most economically free, that have less government, less intrusive regulations, laws that protect private property, have per capita income 6 times higher than countries in which these economic freedoms are not protected. She concludes by saying, our country is not at a fork in the road trying to decide which way to turn. The reality, she says, we've already taken the wrong turn. The massive government spending and debt weighing us down mean we must unwind from many bad decisions in the past. And she goes on to say that the current government shutdown is a sign of where we're headed. We're shut down because Democrats want to spend more money. Well, if nothing else, these are 2 articles that we'll be talking about probably next Wednesday once the election takes place. As I mentioned just the other day, I'll be broadcasting live from New Mexico, and that'll be a remote broadcast, but we'll pull some of these facts and figures back out and say, is this an exception or is this potentially the rule? Is this a one-off or is this a preview of coming attractions? And certainly we will be focusing on some of that after what I suspect will be the election of Zoran Mamdani, a name we've been mentioning quite often here, and something that even in a dinner last night, one of the donors to Point of View brought up that issue and just shook her head. Couldn't even imagine that this is about ready to unfold. So that's all the more reason why my next booklet has to do with the road to serfdom and some of the reasons why we should reject socialism. But let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to have a great conversation, I believe, with Jason Riley, the Affirmative Action Myth, Why Blacks Don't Need Racial Preferences to Succeed. He'll give us the history, talk about the policies, and I think we'll open up the phones, give you a chance to ask some questions of him as well. All that coming up right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kerby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to be talking about affirmative action, and we'll get into DEI and a variety of other issues as well, because as I've been promoting, we are privileged to have with us today Jason Riley. His book, The Affirmative Action Myth, Why Blacks Don't Need Racial Preferences to Succeed, is a book that I think I would highly recommend that you read, especially if you're trying to make sense out of racial preferences and the issue of affirmative action, DEI, even reparations. We'll get into all of that because it's all part of that book. Came out a couple of months ago. We have information about it on our website. You can get it in hardback or Kindle. I suspect you'll be able to find it in your local bookstore, so we'll look there first. But if not, we've made it very easy for you to find it. Jason Riley is an individual we quote from some time to time. I was just noticing, and I clicked on the search engine there. I think we have at least a half a dozen articles or columns where either we're posting his article or we're quoting from him recently, and he is the senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He also is a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, author of a couple of books, but the one that we're talking about today is Affirmative Action. But I might also point you to the one called Maverick, which is a biography of Thomas Sowell. So, Jason Riley, welcome to Point of View.
Thank you for having me on. Glad to be here.
Let's, if we can, get into the history, but before we do, I love the fact that you opened by talking about this movie that I quote from time to time, Hidden Figures, which is the story of a number of African-American women that worked at NASA, because in some respects it is a reminder of how gifted they were, especially in figures and developing computer technology in its formative years, but also a reminder of some of the segregation and the colored bathrooms and the rest. And you use that to kind of remind us that the subtitle of your book is Why Blacks Don't Need Racial Preferences to Succeed.
Yes. And the reason I start with the story of Hidden Figures, which was a popular movie about 10 years ago, it came out, but it was based on a book of the same name, written by a woman named Margot Shetterly, whose father also worked at NASA, was a scientist at NASA, black scientist at NASA. And what strikes me about the movie and the book is what it says about black history, beyond its immediate subject matter, which is the women you mentioned, these black female scientists who were hired in the 1940s and 50s. They were all college graduates, very talented. Some of them were second-generation college graduates from leading universities. And what it tells me is two things. One, there was a black middle class in place before affirmative action. And B, it was growing at a pretty rapid clip, far more rapidly than it would be growing during the era of affirmative action, which I date to the late 60s and early 70s. These women showed what blacks were doing. The communities they came from showed what blacks were capable of. Business owners, architects, doctors, safe, neat black neighborhoods. All of this was going on despite the fact that segregation was also going on. Right. Legal segregation, government-sponsored segregation. This is what blacks were able to accomplish. And I think it's an important point to make because people look at black-white gaps today or high unemployment rates or high dropout rates from school and so forth, and they want to blame racism. And I say, well, wait a minute. Racism isn't anything new, and if anything, there's less of it today than there used to be. So something else must be explaining what's going on today. We can't chalk it all up to racism, because you can point to these women who were able to overcome far greater odds than blacks today.
Great story. By the way, again, you also, of course, document the fact that the black poverty rate dropped almost in half because from the 1940s to the 1960s, and this is before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so you're saying there's something else, and that's the first chapter. Ain't misbehaving, the politics of responsibility. And it does seem to me that if you had an intact home, a father and a mother, if you had discipline, some of the issues that are maybe still out on the streets today wouldn't be taking place. And so in some respects, you take some of that back in your first chapter to this issue of personal responsibility.
Oh, absolutely. And that was the focus in the first half of the 20th century. That's what blacks were focused on. You saw more intact families. You saw more two-parent homes. And I think that's why you saw the upward mobility that you just described. Between 1940 and 1960, the black poverty rate fell by 40 percentage points. No affirmative action program has ever replicated that result, come close to replicating that result. No government welfare program, no Great Society program has ever come close to doing what blacks did on their own before these policies existed, before the Great Society, before affirmative action, before a black president, before blacks had any kind of real political clout in this country in terms of mayors running big cities with large black populations, or black governors or senators or what have you. This was all done in an era where there were tremendous odds that blacks had to overcome, and yet they were able to do that. And I think one of the reasons was an intact family. You know, as recently as the early 1960s, 2 out of 3 black children were being raised in a home with a mother and a father.
Yeah.
Today, more than 3 in 4 are not. That's a huge, huge problem. It's a huge, huge issue. Even in terms of household income, it makes a big difference. So, for instance, in the first half of the 20th century, you saw black earnings as a percentage of white earnings growing all through the 40s, all through the 50s, and into the 60s. That trend starts to slow down and stall in the 1970s. And one of the reasons why is that you saw a proliferation of single-parent homes in the black community starting in the late 60s and early 70s. And, just that having 2 incomes versus 1 income is obviously going to make a huge difference in a family. And so, yes, I think a lot of this can be traced to the breakdown of the black family that we saw occurring beginning in the late 60s. And even affirmative action, even racial preferences have not been able to overcome that breakdown of the black family.
Interesting statistic. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into then, okay, what about this idea of affirmative action that morphed from equal treatment to equal results, how the goalpost moved. But again, as you're thinking about this, recognize that just 2 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that the use of race in college admissions was unconstitutional. And that's when you had the doomsayers saying, well, that is going to mean that we are going to no longer have a black middle class, means that the end of upward advancement of African Americans is not going to take place. As you might gather, Jason Riley disagrees and gives you some very good facts and figures. So we'll get into this whole idea of what was intended with affirmative action, and then how indeed that has changed the culture and the family, and what we can do to begin to once again come back to the subtitle, Why Blacks Don't Need Racial Preferences to Succeed. We'll continue our conversation with Jason Riley about his book, The Affirmative Action Myth, right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In this commentary, I want to explain an interesting business pattern that developed in China. It illustrates what many have called the catfish effect. What's the catfish effect? Well, live sardines are more expensive than frozen sardines and more valuable because they have better flavor and texture. One ship in Norway has always been able to bring sardines home because the captain put a catfish in the tank. The sardines had to keep swimming to avoid their predator. The catfish effect is used in business to describe what happens when the strong competitor stimulates the other companies to be more competitive and innovative. The Tesla Gigafactory in Shanghai is often cited as the catfish. This explains China's unique exception to their general business model. China has worked to keep many companies out of the country. Those they let in come under full control of the Chinese government. Tesla was the exception. China supported the company with land, loans, and tax benefits. That seemed like a puzzle until you realized that Tesla became the catfish for China's electric vehicle industry. They set up shop and immediately began selling cars, but their presence stimulated the other electric car companies. They started copying the techniques used by Tesla in production and deploying camera-based autopilot. Tesla also discovered they needed parts that weren't being manufactured in China. By demanding these cutting-edge materials from suppliers, they were also providing them to the other China car companies. Once the Tesla catfish was dropped into the China tank, all the companies started swimming faster. That is why China did something few expected. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Jason Riley with us as we talk about his new book, The Affirmative Action Myth. Might mention his previous book, Please Stop Helping Us, and some of the others that he has written about. But Jason, if we can, we probably need to give a little bit of history of affirmative action. But it is interesting that as we get to that chapter on equal treatment to equal results, you quote from a New York Times piece in which they were asking a very racially and socioeconomically diverse group of 12 students if they supported affirmative action. Just one person said yes. So they already were beginning to understand that that was not necessarily helpful. But affirmative action was implemented as a policy to help African Americans, and it obviously hurt them. But can you give us some of the background, take us back to 1964 and 65? Because in some respects, the idea is that this is something is going to help advance a group of individuals that had been persecuted because of slavery, segregation, and Jim Crow. Can you speak to that?
Sure, and that's an important point because the term affirmative action does mean different things to different people. And originally, affirmative action was about outreach, pure and simple. We're going to offer opportunities to groups that historically have been overlooked, whether in the workplace or on college campuses. That was the idea, to outreach to these overlooked groups and helping to bring them up to current standards, to be hired, to matriculate on a college campus, and so forth. What it became, however, in practice was lowering standards to get a certain racial mix on campus. It turned into quotas and set-asides. That's what it became in practice. That's what it is today. That's what the Supreme Court overturned. And there are still people out there who pretend it still only means the former definition. And so you do have to nail down. And it's interesting that when you look at surveys and look at the wording of the question on affirmative action, the more specific the question is about what affirmative action is in reality, that is racial preferences, the worse it polls. And the poll you cite of those students is a good example of that. But it's nothing new. In other words, that first definition of affirmative action, outreach, has long been popular with huge swaths of the American public going all the way back to the 1960s. That is not something people mostly opposed. They supported it. It had broad public support. What has also had overwhelmingly negative response to are quotas and set-asides and racial preferences. And that's, again, whether you're asking black people or white people, no one, that has never been popular. Racial preferences has never been popular. And in fact, the polls taken after the Supreme Court ruling 2 years ago showed something like 70% of the public agreed with the Supreme Court decision, including a majority of blacks, a majority of whites, a majority of Hispanics, and a majority of Asians. So there's a small group of elites, academics, activists, and politicians that love these racial preference policies, but they've never been popular with the general public, not 50 years ago and not today.
You know, and I was thinking, too, since I'm one of the old guys around the table, I lived through some of that, and I remember what would be called the Bakke decision, 1978. That was a Supreme Court decision, had to do with UC Davis, University of California at Davis, and one in which you had a ruling that even at that time, and that goes back a long ways if you think about this, there were supposed to not be using race as the sole and defining factor in admissions. So I think it makes your point that in many cases there was already resistance to that in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. Now we find ourselves in the 2020s when we finally have a decision. But it wasn't like this is something that just sprung up under the Trump administration, was it?
Oh, no, not at all. In fact, colorblindness, and that's really what we're talking about here. Colorblindness was the central driving purpose of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. That's what Martin Luther King was all about. That's what Thurgood Marshall was about. Judging people without regard to race, not due to race. Not the government not picking favorites based on race, not picking winners and losers based on race, but a colorblind approach, a universal standard that applied to all groups of all backgrounds and ethnicities and so forth. Today's civil rights leadership has flipped that on its head. It's all about racial preferences. And the word colorblind has become a dirty word.
Yes.
Politically, on the political left. They're not for colorblindness. When you're for colorblindness, you don't name your organization Black Lives Matter and then get upset when people say all lives matter. You don't support racial preferences in hiring and admissions. You don't support racially gerrymandered voting districts. The left today is all about race consciousness. DEI is all about race consciousness, and that is the complete opposite of what the civil rights movement was about. And I think the civil rights movement was so successful, the reason we got the Brown ruling and the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act is because King and those guys appealed to universal principles of fairness, and they got a lot of non-blacks to come along with them in supporting those goals. Today, the leadership is pushing again for race-specific proposals, and they're just not popular. People like colorblindness.
Let me, if I can, just before we take a break, maybe have you talk for just a minute about critical theory and critical race theory, because Chapter 3 gets into Derek Bell and all the ideas of critical theory, because in some respects that has even changed affirmative action even more so, because the argument is that if you are a victim, you don't even have to give a justification for why you need preferences, and if you're identified as an oppressor, you don't have a right to speak to that issue. And so that's been something that has even changed the view of affirmative action more significantly, hasn't it?
It has. This critical race theory used to be something that was sort of relegated to college campuses and college seminars, and now it's sort of crawled off of campus and is infecting our workplace diversity training programs. and even our K through 12 curriculum in the form of the 1619 Project. And it's unfortunate. It's extremely unfortunate because we are an increasingly diverse society in terms of racially and ethnicity and so forth, and only becoming more so. And the idea that you have the critical race theorists out there who want a sort of racial grievance industry in this country is sad. It makes absolutely no sense. It's very divisive. And as I was saying, based on the polls and surveys, Americans don't like it. But yet, again, you have a group of elites that continue to push this. And they are elites. Those are the people who support affirmative action, because to the extent that it's been beneficial for anyone, it has helped elites. It has helped, namely, blacks who were already better off to begin with. So even though these policies are sold in the name of helping the black poor or the underprivileged, it is mostly middle-class blacks who benefit from these policies. And the critical race theorists that was dreamed up again by middle-class blacks and people like Derek Bell. And he was pretty honest about why he wanted critical race theory. It was basically an affirmative action program. He wanted race and ethnicity used as a hiring credential on campuses for professors, and that's what it's become. That's what it's out there doing. It's a way of it's a fancy justification for affirmative action. That's all it is. But again, it is not broadly popular in the U.S., and I believe it's becoming unpopular by the day.
I think so. And part of that, it may just be because, first of all, counting by race is harder because we have more interracial marriages. You, of course, as you pointed out just a minute ago, you have a lot less racism, either overt or even inherent, and those are issues. But let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into some other chapters, the reparations ruckus. We haven't gotten to that very contentious issue and a couple others, but let me just mention that if you would like to join the conversation, we'll open up the phones, give you a chance to ask a question or make a comment. Jason Riley with us, and that number is 800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. Affirmative action, and really we've been talking about, of course, the issue of what has happened to everything from black wages to home ownership, educational attainment, those kinds of issues, whether or not the special treatment of idea, which morphed from the idea of equal treatment, is really holding some individuals back. And of course, the subtitle of the book is Why Blacks Don't Need Racial Preferences to Succeed. So if you'd like to know more about Jason Riley or see many of his other articles, you can certainly go to the website pointofview.net. We also have a link to jasonrileyonline.com. As I mentioned, senior fellow for the Manhattan Institute. You can find out more about any of the books that he has written, various articles that he's written, and all of it available at our website at pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll come back and continue our conversation of the affirmative action myth. We'll be back right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Jason Riley. The book is entitled The Affirmative Action Myth. We have information about him and the book on the website. And if you would like to join us, we'll take some phone calls in just a minute, 1-800-351-1212. But Jason, I thought it might be good to talk about reparations because you talk about Elizabeth Warren and maybe some people like Kamala Harris and Cory Booker talking about that. But you also remind us that back when he ran for president, Barack Obama, as well as Hillary Clinton and others, were not interested in reparations because that was oftentimes seen as sort of a fringe issue. So this whole reparations discussion has been going on for some time, and it's kind of ebbed and flowed. But help us understand where it is right now and whether or not we'll ever see reparations paid to those individuals who are the ancestors of slaves.
Well, I don't think we're going to see reparations paid to anyone, and I just don't think it's something the majority of Americans will ever go for, and I don't think it makes a lot of sense. All the slaves are gone, all the slave owners are gone, and so you're really asking the descendants of slave owners to pay reparations to the descendants of slaves. In fact, it's worse than that because most white Americans trace their ancestry to people who came here after the Civil War. So you're really asking people who aren't even descendants of slave owners to pay reparations to people who were never slaves. I mean, it
makes no sense.
It really reaches that level of absurdity. It's also, when you think about it, all reparations is another huge wealth redistribution scheme. And, we've tried this before. If simply sending out government checks to people solved poverty or reduced inequality, we would have solved this a long time ago. We're good at doing it. We've had trillions of dollars have gone into wealth redistribution schemes since the 1960s. That's what the whole Great Society was about under Lyndon Baines Johnson. It doesn't work. So not only do I think it's unpopular outside of certain quarters on the left, I just don't think it would work. I don't think it would address the problems that people think it would address. There's another point to be made here. One of the justifications for reparations that has become more popular is the one made by Ta-Nehisi Coates and some others, Nicole Hannah-Jones and others, and that is redlining. They bring up redlining.
Yes.
And this was when it was difficult in the 30s and 40s for blacks to secure loans for mortgages, and they were discriminated against. And there were these zones that the banks, if you lived within the zone, the bank wouldn't lend you money, or it was very, very difficult to get a loan. Well, one of the problems with basing reparations on redlining is that while a disproportionate number of blacks lived in these redlined zones, more whites than blacks lived in redlined areas overall. So if you're paying reparations based on who was redlined, you'd have to pay a lot of reparations to white people. So I just think this is a nonsensical scheme that it's gained currency on the left to the extent that progressivism has gained currency on the left, and this is one of those zany proposals that progressives go for. But I don't even think mainstream Democrats would support this in the end.
I don't think so either. Again, the book is entitled The Affirmative Action Myth. Let's go to the phones, 1-800-351-1212. In Georgia, Benjamin, thank you for calling today.
Hello, how you doing today, gentlemen?
What would you like to share with us?
Right, I'm a long-time listener. I really appreciate everything that y'all do. I'm Shan. I'm a U.S. military veteran, retired, 26 years of service from the end of the Cold War up until about 10 years ago when I retired. And the Army is a great model of action without that affirmative action. The only affirmation you got was work hard. and you can go ahead and move up. All that minorities needed post World War II and 48 during desegregation of the military was just that, desegregation. I've worked in many positions and jobs throughout the 26 years I was in. I was also an Army brat, so it's been my whole life, and it's amazing where I've seen the military go from in the late 80s, especially in my job career. I was a airborne infantryman, where you had, when I was in the 101st Airborne, two tours there, you had a lot less African Americans. Usually, of about 500 troops in a battalion, you would only have maybe about 15 to 20 infantrymen out of the 300 that were African American. You had a lot more Hispanics. But the thing is, I think that when people are given an opportunity to excel, as we see with some of the early generals that we had in the Air Force and in the Army, in the 50s and 60s, I think all these men and women needed was an opportunity. Unfortunately, the world has gone where the Army doesn't influence American culture, but American culture is influencing the Army.
Yes.
And the backpedaling of some of the things that the Department of Defense is trying to change with Secretary Hegseth are some good things. It'd be nice to see the guys keep beards, which was something that was stopped after World War I because of gas masks. But a lot of things could be better discipline and structure. And definitely, I feel keeping young ladies out of infantry is a great thing to give women an opportunity. But
Okay, Benjamin, let me just give Jason a chance to react, because you've got some great points there. One of those is there's a place where you believe in a meritocracy. It doesn't matter what your race is. As a matter of fact, it should be irrelevant, and that seems to be where we're moving, Jason Riley.
Yes, that's certainly the direction that this administration seems to want to move in, and I would applaud that. And I agree with the caller entirely that opportunity is what blacks have always most needed. Opportunity, equal treatment, not special treatment. We started out by talking about those women in Hidden Figures, the movie and the book. No one lowered any standards to hire those women. They had to meet the current standards, and they did. They met them. What they needed was the opportunity. And when FDR signed an executive order saying that there was not going to be any more racial discrimination in hiring in the defense industry, they were given the opportunity to work in places like NASA, and they took advantage of it. And that is what blacks have excelled at doing when they have been given the opportunity. And that is what they did well before affirmative action, is seize opportunities, whether it was opportunities to get a better education, opportunities to get higher pay. And if you look at the trends, it really is remarkable. The trends in home ownership rates, the trends in years of education, the trends in entering middle-class professions, the trends in income, all of these things. Blacks weren't just making absolute gains. They were gaining on whites. The gaps were closing. They were narrowing. All of those things start to slow, and in some cases even reverse course, starting in the late 60s and particularly in the early 70s, around the advent of affirmative action policies, racial preferences. Those trends start to slow. So I argue that these policies have not only been ineffective, I think they've largely been harmful in terms of slowing pre-existing growth trends and positive trends in the black community.
Let's take another phone call. We'll go out to California. Kathy, thank you for calling today. You're on with Jason Riley.
Yes, I've noticed that the ones that keep yelling racism seems to be also committing it against their own people. But not only that, because that's like in the Middle East, but not only that, I am in this state where Prop 50, for example, we've been inundated by Democrats and how racially the people are not being representative in our state. They've come out and say dark people, light colored people, they're being discriminated. And if we don't vote this in to change how we had already voted in a commission for our for that because they're trying to redistrict and gerrymandered the Democrats right back into office. And I believe with that, they're going to try to go right back to what we had in Trump's first presidency.
Let me take a break, and when we come back, I'd love to get Jason's comments, because that gets into, again, whether or not we need to divide these various congressional districts. That gets back to the Voting Rights Act, 1965, and a number of other things. And, of course, the issue there in the state of California. And, by the way, Jason, we have quite a number of listeners, as you probably already figured out, from Georgia to California. But certainly our listeners in California are facing some of those issues. So we'll come back. I want to get your thoughts about that, because that is another aspect of the issue of counting by race, which also helps advance a particular political party. So we'll talk about that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Jason Riley with us as we talk about his book, The Affirmative Action Myth. But Kathy raised a very good question, Jason, and 2 weeks ago you wrote a very good piece in the Wall Street Journal, Racial Gerrymandering is a Bad Idea Whose Time Has Come. And that really gets us back to the Civil Rights Act and a remedy that I think the Supreme Court is going to hand down. Your thoughts?
Yes. It's a fascinating topic, and because what it illustrates is that the political left won't admit it's not still 1964 in this country, because it's bad for them politically to make such an admission. And so we get these efforts to put in place policies, or in the case of the Voting Rights Act, keep in place certain policies that pretend it's still the early 1960s. Their problem is that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a phenomenally successful piece of legislation. In the Deep South, you had states like Georgia, Mississippi, with black voter registration in the single digits.
Right.
By 1966, a year after the Voting Rights Act passed, you had voter registration rates 50-60% in the Deep South. I mean, it was a phenomenally successful piece of legislation. And black voting trends, turnout rates, registration rates have continued in the right direction for decades. In 2008 and 2012, black voter turnout was higher than white voter turnout in this country. Black voter turnout rates were higher than white voter turnout rates. In 2020, blacks voted at higher rates than whites in Maryland, in Missouri, in Mississippi, in Tennessee. I remember Stacey Abrams became the face of voter suppression, starts this organization after she loses the governor's race in Georgia about fighting voter suppression. In Georgia, when she started that organization in 2018, black voter registration and turnout in her state was higher than white voter registration and turnout in her state. I mean, it was a solution in search of a problem. So, again, the left is pretending, and that is why we're having this fight over the Voting Rights Act. The black franchise is not in jeopardy. No one is going after the black franchise. What people want to do, rightfully, I believe, is update the Voting Rights Act to reflect the reality today. Many of these provisions that were put in place, like racially gerrymandered districts or like what they call pre-clearances, when a state has to go to the federal government and ask permission before they change any voting procedures in their states, all of that is no longer necessary because we've made progress. This is good news. And there are people who want to update those provisions, and the left is fighting this because they like to use these provisions to pretend it's still 1964 and that we still need things like racially gerrymandered voting districts. I mean, think about this. This idea is based on the supposedly that whites won't vote for a black candidate. We've elected a black president twice in a majority white country. Yet they want to keep this provision in place. It's also based on, I think, the sort of condescending view that all blacks have the same political interests, whether you're rural, whether you're urban, whether you're rich, whether you're poor. You don't care. You just need a black face in Congress representing you. Also, I would add that most of the Congressional Black Caucus represents districts that are not majority black, which again gets at this idea that whites won't vote for someone black. So, yes, I think these are outdated provisions. I hope the Supreme Court does away with them so that we can update the Voting Rights Act to reflect the reality today. I think they will. They will do that, but that's why this is being fought. And I also want to make one last point, which is to separate this from gerrymandering and map drawing in general. You're never going to get the politics out of that.
Nope.
And I am not in favor of all this mid-decade redistricting that's going on right now, this tit for tat, whether it's New York, California, Texas, or what have you. That needs to stop. I want the Supreme Court to do something about that as well. But the least they can do is get the race factor out of this process.
One other aspect, since you talk about voter suppression, just think about the fact, Jason, that 4 years ago, the All-Star Game was not held in Atlanta, but was moved to Denver because the argument was that requiring African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and others to show a voter ID would be actually voter suppression, and those restrictions in the state of Georgia were enough to move the All-Star Game. And I think it illustrates again the need for your book, because this was just 4 years ago in which we had those kind of arguments being made, which now I think some common sense is starting to break out all over the country.
Yeah, the left really wants to keep racial controversies front and center in our conversations, even when they don't belong there. They don't want us to move past race. They don't want to be post-racial. They don't want to be colorblind. They think these issues help them politically, keeping blacks angry and paranoid. It's how some politicians win votes. It's how activists raise money. And so they want us out there fighting over racial issues. And I think a lot of the country wants to move on. But unfortunately, one of our major parties thinks they get a lot of political mileage out of these racial controversies.
Let me just mention that, first of all, we have a link to jasonrileyonline.com. There's a place where if you would like to get some of his other books or even this one, you can get that. There's a contact point if you'd like to have him come and speak, and certainly we have posted many of his articles. But one of the reasons you wrote this is to actually move to a point where we, as you point out, maybe move past the affirmative action era and move into one where we really do come to the idea of evaluating people on the basis of their character, on the basis of their merit, and not on the basis of their skin color. And it does seem to me that the vestiges of that are being removed by the Trump administration, and as you just pointed out, may be removed by the Supreme Court. So that's why you wrote the book, and I certainly thank you for writing it and giving us some time today to talk about it.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
We're going to encourage you to find some great material here. First of all, we do have a link to his website, which I think you would find very helpful. Just a minute ago, I mentioned some of his pieces that appear on the Wall Street Journal, so we have that there as well. But this we thought was very important because you're still finding a lot of people that say we are dealing with white supremacy, or there's some that fit there, of course, systemic racism, harder and harder to find, insists that we not only needed affirmative action, but we even need DEI initiatives. That's diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, these sound good. Affirmative action. Certainly, I want to be affirming individuals. Certainly, I believe in diversity and I want to include people. But as he points out very early on in the book, it is moved from this idea of equal opportunity to equal outcome, as well as from equal treatment to special treatment. And so if you're not familiar with some of the writings of Jason Riley, you can certainly find them, certainly in the Wall Street Journal. You can also find many of his books, and of course this one, The Affirmative Action Myth, is certainly one that I would encourage you to get a copy of. Why Blacks Don't Need to Racial Preferences to Succeed, as well as a couple of others. He's done actually 2 biographies on Thomas Sowell, the most recent one, Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell, and all sorts of other resources that are available. If you'd like to know more, of course, you can find him at the website pointofview.net. As you go there, don't forget that we, of course, have posted my commentary. We have a take action item. We have a video. Lots of great resources that are available to you on the website pointofview.net. And if you believe that this is a program that needs to continue, you might even click on that button that says donate now and support this organization as well. That's all we have for today. As always, I want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.